Some men are born to fight. Achilles was born for glory. The greatest warrior the world had ever seen. A man the gods themselves had marked, whose presence on a battlefield didn't just change the outcome. It decided it before it began. Men who faced him did not simply lose, they disappeared. But the story of Achilles is not really about the men he destroyed. It is about what his own pride destroyed in him. His honor, his closest friend, in the future he had chosen before he ever reached the shores of Troy. Achilles knew the prophecy: live a long life and be forgotten, or win eternal glory at Troy and die young. He chose glory. And from that one choice, everything that followed was inevitable. But to understand what Achilles truly lost, we have to go back to where it all started. The Trojan War did not begin with armies. It began with an insult. That insult was small enough to fit in one hand. A golden apple. It rolled into a wedding hall on Mount Olympus, tossed by the only goddess who had not been invited, Eris, goddess of discord. 4 words were carved into it: for the most beautiful. The room went quiet. Then 3 hands reached for it at once. Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom; Aphrodite, goddess of love. 3 goddesses, 1 apple, and none of them were willing to let go. Zeus refused to choose. He was many things, but he was not stupid. So the decision fell to a mortal, a young Trojan prince named Paris, living quietly as a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. He was about to have his life destroyed by a question he never asked to answer. Each goddess made him an offer. Hera offered power that would give him dominion over kingdoms and the respect of every king who had ever lived. Athena offered wisdom and skill in battle, enough to make him the greatest general the world had ever seen. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. It was not a difficult decision for a young man. It was, however, the worst decision in the history of the world. The woman Aphrodite had in mind was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of Menelaus, one of the most powerful kings in Greece. That didn't stop Paris. He sailed to Sparta, accepted Menelaus's hospitality, sat at his table, and left with his wife. Menelaus called his brother, Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, commander of men, the most powerful ruler in the Greek world. And Agamemnon understood immediately what this meant. This was not just an insult to one man. This was an insult that required a war. The kings of Greece had sworn an oath years before that whoever married Helen would be protected by all the others. It had seemed like a formality at the time. Now Agamemnon called it in. The ships gathered at the port of Aulis, the largest fleet the world had ever seen, pointed east toward a city on the other side of the sea, Troy. They reached Troy with 1,000 ships and the largest army the world had ever seen, certain that the city would be theirs before the year was out. But Troy did not fall. Its walls had never been broken, and its defenders knew how to hold them. The only reason the war had not already been lost was that the Greeks had Achilles. While he fought, they won. While he rested, they survived. The whole campaign ran on one man's willingness to keep showing up. And so the war dragged on, year after year, until 9 years had passed. And in those 9 years, Achilles had received many honors from the war. But the most visible of them was a woman named Briseis, bestowed upon him as a sign of the honor the army had given him. And that was the problem. Agamemnon commanded kings, but Achilles commanded something more dangerous: admiration. Every prize, every honor, every moment of recognition reminded everyone that the most powerful king in Greece was not the most important man in the camp. That was something Agamemnon had never been able to forgive. Then the plague came. It moved through the Greek camp like a quiet execution. Soldiers burning with fever, dying before they could reach a battlefield. The gods were sending a message, and when the reason became clear, Agamemnon had taken Chryseis, the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and refused to return her. There was a simple solution: make it right. Agamemnon refused, not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to. He was the High King, and High Kings did not back down. Not for priests, not for plagues, not for anyone. It was the first time the Greeks saw exactly who was leading them. It would not be the last. Agamemnon finally had to agree to return Chryseis when he saw the bodies kept piling up. But not without a condition. If Agamemnon had to give up what was his, someone would have to lose something too. Agamemnon didn't hesitate. He stood before the entire army and announced it plainly. If Chryseis was being taken from him, then Achilles would have to give up Briseis, his prize, his honor, gone by order of the High King, in front of every man who had ever followed Achilles into battle. It was not just a theft. It was a humiliation. Achilles felt something ignite in him. He had spent 9 years bleeding for this war. 9 years of victories that kept the Greek camp alive. 9 years of watching lesser men take credit for what his sword had made possible. And now, the man who had done the least fighting and demanded the most glory was standing in front of him, taking the one thing that was his. He came close to killing Agamemnon where he stood. His hand was already on his sword. Then Athena came down, unseen by everyone except Achilles. She seized him by the hair and held him back. Not here, not like this. There is a better way to make Agamemnon understand what he has just done. Achilles let go of the sword, and then he said something that would cost the Greeks everything. He was done. He would not fight. Not for Agamemnon, not for this war. Not for a king who repaid loyalty with theft. He would sit on the shore and watch while the army that had depended on him learned what it felt like to face Troy without him. He walked away. The camp went quiet in a way it never had before. Not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of men who had just understood that something irreplaceable had left. Among all the Greeks, only Patroclus, his closest companion, saw the wound beneath the anger. That night, Achilles went to the water and called for his mother. Thetis rose from the sea and listened to everything: the theft, the humiliation, the rage that had nowhere to go. And when he finished, he asked her for one thing: go to Zeus. Ask him to let the Greeks suffer without him. Let them lose. Let them bleed. Let Agamemnon stand on that battlefield and finally understand the difference between a king and the man who made him one. Thetis went to Olympus and laid Achilles' pain before Zeus. Zeus, Lord of the gods, listened. Then he agreed. Without Achilles, the Greeks pushed forward and got nothing. The Trojans, who had spent 9 years on the defensive, suddenly found themselves with something they hadn't had in almost a decade: the advantage. And Troy, the city that had not fallen in 9 years, began, for the first time, to feel like it might never fall at all. Without Achilles, the war changed. The Greeks still had kings. They still had thousands of men. But they no longer had the one man Troy feared most. And Troy knew it. The Trojans felt the Greek army could be pressured, tested, even broken. But they also knew every new assault would keep costing lives. So Paris offered a different way to end it. If he had started this war, then he would finish it himself. Single combat against Menelaus. One fight, winner takes Helen, and the armies go home. The Greeks accepted. It was never close. Menelaus drove Paris back again and again, until the man who had begun the war could barely stay on his feet. For one brief moment, the armies watching from both sides understood what was about to happen. If Menelaus struck him down, the war might finally have an ending. Then Aphrodite intervened. Before Menelaus could finish it, she covered Paris in mist and carried him away from the battlefield. Humiliated, branded a coward, but alive. But saving Paris was not enough. Paris was alive, but humiliated. If Helen rejected him now, then everything he had caused would stand exposed for what it was. A war built around a man who could not even fight for the woman he claimed he loved. So Aphrodite sent Helen to him. Helen refused. She felt ashamed of what she had just witnessed. Paris had failed, and only with the help of a goddess had he survived. For a moment, she looked at him not as the man who had taken her from Sparta, but as the man who had let others bleed for him. But Aphrodite did not ask twice. She warned Helen not to defy her, and Helen understood that even shame had limits when a goddess stood against you. So she went to Paris, not with peace in her heart, not with love untouched by disgust, but with desire, fear, shame, and the power of a goddess still tangled together inside her. Outside, on the battlefield, the silence broke. The war had been inches from ending, and only because of the whim of a goddess, it was alive again. But something was different. Achilles was still absent. So instead of shrinking back behind their walls, the Trojans pushed forward with a confidence they had not felt in 9 years. At their front rode Hector, son of Priam, prince of Troy, and the man who carried the city on his shoulders. Hector was not Achilles. Achilles fought for glory. Hector fought because if Troy fell, he would lose more than a kingdom. He would lose everything he loved. Inside the walls, Andromache waited for him. War had already taken almost everything from her. And now, the only man she had left was walking out into battle every day. When Hector returned to Troy, she found him near the ramparts and asked him to stay. Not forever. Just today. Let another man stand at the front. Let another man take the risk. Let Troy keep its prince alive one more day. Hector listened, and the answer hurt before he even said it. He could not hide behind other men while Troy was fighting for its survival. He knew the city might fall one day. He knew war would eventually take everything it wanted, but not today. Today, he still had to stand. Then he reached for his son. The boy cried at the sight of his father's war helmet, and Hector laughed, because for one brief moment, he forgot everything about the war and became only a man trying to make his son stop crying. He removed the helmet, held his son, and prayed that one day the boy would be greater than him. Then he remembered what he was fighting for. So he gave him back to Andromache and walked toward the gates. She watched him go, knowing that every time Hector left, Troy survived a little longer, and she lost him a little more. The Greeks were not being annihilated. They were being broken piece by piece. Hector was everywhere. The Trojans no longer fought like men trapped behind walls. They fought like men who had remembered they could win. Every Greek charge became weaker. Every retreat came sooner. And across the camp, the same truth began to settle in, even if no one wanted to say it aloud. Without Achilles, they were not winning this war. Agamemnon saw it too. He did not want to, but he saw it. So the High King of Mycenae did the one thing his pride had never allowed before. He sent for Achilles. Not with a command, but with an offer. Briseis would be returned untouched. Treasure, gold, horses, cities, even one of his own daughters in marriage. Everything a king could offer, short of kneeling. And he sent the men Achilles might actually hear. Phoenix, who had known him since childhood. Odysseus, whose words could open doors no sword could break. And Ajax, the giant warrior who understood battle better than speeches. If anyone could bring Achilles back, it was them. They found him by the shore, outside his tent, with a lyre in his hands. Patroclus sat beside him, quiet as always. Not pushing him, not asking him to return, just staying close enough that Achilles was not alone, and silent enough not to turn his pain into an argument. That was what made Patroclus different. Others came to Achilles when they needed something from him: victory, strength, Fear, the name that made Trojans run. Patroclus stayed even when Achilles had nothing to give. He had seen the pride, the fury, and the pain beneath them both. Odysseus laid out the offer carefully. Briseis would be returned, gifts beyond measure would be given, Achilles' honor would be restored. Everything Agamemnon had refused to offer before, now placed at Achilles' feet. Achilles listened to all of it, then said no. The gifts meant nothing. The apology meant nothing. Agamemnon could give him 10 times as much and still not undo what had been done in front of the army. He had carried their victories for 9 years. He had filled Trojan graves and kept Greek ships from burning. And when the most powerful king in Greece felt small, he chose to cut Achilles down just to feel great again. Achilles looked at them and gave his answer.
Let Agamemnon fight his own war. Let him hide behind his kings, his speeches, and his prizes. I will not return.
The men who had come to save the army left knowing they had failed. Only Patroclus remained. That night he watched Achilles by the fire and said little. He knew better than to force words out of him. But he saw what Achilles could not see in himself. The anger was no longer protecting him. It was consuming him. Outside, the Greeks were running out of time. Hector drove the Trojans all the way to the Greek ships. The same ships that had carried them across the sea, the same ships that were supposed to carry them home. Now, they were the last line between the army and destruction. Men fell back through the camp. The wounded filled the sand. The shouting moved closer and closer to the shore. And still, Achilles did not move. Patroclus heard it all. The screams, the clash of bronze, the panic in the voices of men who had once believed Troy would fall easily. Then he saw the smoke. The Trojans had reached the ships. Fire rose against the night, and Achilles sat beside it all, silent, while the war he had abandoned began to burn. Patroclus had watched long enough. Patroclus had been beside Achilles from the beginning, through the long years of war and the long nights by the fire, through every silence, every refusal, and even the night Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix came begging him to return. But there are limits to what a man can watch in silence. The ships were burning, their friends were dying, and the Trojans had reached the shore. The war that had once seemed far away from Achilles' tent was now close enough to breathe. The Greek camp was breaking, and still Achilles would not move. So Patroclus went to him. He did not ask Achilles to return. He knew better than that. Pride had locked that door, and no argument could open it now. Instead, he asked for something smaller, the armor, just the armor. Let him take the Myrmidons into battle wearing the weapons of Achilles, and the Trojans would break. They did not need the real thing. They just needed the fear that came with the name. Achilles looked at him for a long moment, not as a warrior asking for armor, but as the only man who had stayed beside him when everyone else, even kings, had failed to understand what he was carrying. And because it was Patroclus, Achilles finally gave him what he would have denied any other man. But with one condition, and he meant every word of it. Drive them back from the ships and return. Do not chase them toward the walls. Do not go looking for glory that is not yours to take. And above everything else, do not go near Hector, Patroclus promised. When he rode out in Achilles' armor, the effect was immediate. The Trojans, who had been pushing forward with confidence, suddenly pulled back, uncertain, looking at each other and then at the figure before them, trying to understand how Achilles had appeared when Achilles had not moved from his tent in weeks. The Greek camp, which had been collapsing since morning, remembered what it felt like to fight under Achilles' shadow. Patroclus pushed them back from the ships. He did what he had promised to do. But victory has a pull to it, the momentum of a battle turning in your favor, the ground giving way beneath the enemy, the sense that today, right now, you are unstoppable. And Patroclus kept going. He pushed deeper into the Trojan lines, further than he had promised, further than was safe. Not because he thought he was betraying Achilles, because for one brief, dangerous moment, he believed he might save him. If he could break the Trojans here, if he could push them back far enough, if he could make this day matter, then maybe Achilles would not have to return at all. Maybe the war could end before Achilles' fate finally caught up with him. So he drove on. Then Apollo found him and warned him to go back. Patroclus did not listen, so the god struck him from behind. And in that moment, everything changed. Apollo took the strength from his body. His helmet fell. His spear broke. The armor that had made him look like Achilles suddenly became only borrowed metal on a man who could no longer defend himself. Euphorbus reached him first and drove the first wound into him. Patroclus staggered, still alive, but the illusion was gone. The Trojans no longer saw Achilles. They saw the truth beneath the armor. Then Hector came. By the time Hector stood over him, Patroclus was no longer the shadow of Achilles. He was only Patroclus, wounded, exposed, and alone. Then Hector stepped forward and ended what Apollo had begun. And Patroclus fell, still trying to save the one man who had never needed saving from anything, except himself. With his last breath, Patroclus gave Hector one last warning.
Achilles is coming.
Hector stripped the armor from Patroclus where he fell. The armor of Achilles now belonged to the man who had killed the one person Achilles could not bear to lose. Hector put it on and walked back toward Troy carrying the greatest trophy a warrior could take, and the worst mistake he would ever make. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles at the shore. For a moment he did not move. He did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply broke. Antilochus, the man who brought the news, grabbed his hands and held them, afraid Achilles might turn them against himself. Because in that moment, Achilles understood the truth. He had asked for the Greeks to suffer without him. Achilles had wanted Agamemnon to feel the weight of his absence. He had wanted the army to understand what it meant to fight without him. But he had never meant for Patroclus to be the one who suffered. Thetis felt his pain from beneath the sea. She rose without being called and found her son with ash on his face, his hands in the dirt, and his world already gone. She knew before he told her. There was nothing she could say to make that pain more bearable. So she held him. When Achilles finally spoke, there was only one name left in him: Hector. Thetis warned him what that meant. If he killed Hector, his own death would not be far behind. Achilles already knew. He had known since before he ever reached Troy. Live long and be forgotten, or win eternal glory and never return from Troy. Before, that choice had sounded like glory. Now it sounded like a sentence he was ready to finish. The gods gave him new armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, bright enough to make men look away. But when Achilles returned to the Greek assembly, there was nothing bright in him. He ended the quarrel with Agamemnon because the quarrel no longer mattered. Briseis was returned. The gifts were brought out. The honor that had started all of this was placed back in front of him. Too late. Achilles looked at all of it and felt nothing. His grief could not be erased with gifts, so he went back to war. But the man who stepped onto that battlefield was not the same man who had left it. The Achilles who once fought for glory, prizes, and the memory of his name was gone. This Achilles fought for one reason. Patroclus was dead, and Hector was still breathing. The Trojans felt him before he reached them. Men who had stood against Greece for 9 years broke at the sight of him. Lines collapsed, warriors ran. The battlefield that had belonged to Hector only hours before now belonged to something colder than rage. Achilles cut through everything between himself and Troy, and Hector waited outside the walls. From above the walls, Priam and Hecuba begged him to come inside. Every voice that loved him told him not to face Achilles alone. Hector knew they were right, but his pride would not let him retreat, because he was Hector, son of Priam, prince of Troy. And if Troy was watching, he could not be seen running from the man who had come for him. Then Achilles appeared. For one moment, Hector stood his ground. Then he truly saw him, Achilles coming straight toward him, driven by rage and grief. And Hector ran. He circled Troy 3 times with Achilles hunting him from behind, while the city watched from above. This was not a duel. It was death closing the distance. Then Athena deceived him. She came to Hector in the shape of his brother Deiphobus and made him believe he would not stand alone. So Hector stopped. He turned. He threw his spear. It struck Achilles' shield and failed. Then he looked for his brother. He was not there. And Hector understood. The gods had left him, but Hector was not going to die running. If this was the end, he would meet it facing forward. So he drew his sword and charged. Achilles knew the armor Hector wore. He knew every plate, every weakness, because it was his. He found the gap and drove the sword through. Hector fell. With the last of his strength, he asked for one thing, that his body be returned to Troy. Achilles looked down at him and refused. And with that, the protector of Troy died. But Achilles was not finished with him. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls while Troy watched from above. The city that Hector had spent his life protecting watched its greatest defender pulled through the dust by the man who had finally broken him. Achilles had done what he came to do, and still, when it was over, his grief had not disappeared. Achilles had believed Hector's death would bring him peace. It did not. The rage was still there. The grief was still there. And because he kept hoping vengeance would quiet the emptiness, he dragged Hector's body through the dust again and again, every morning, for 12 days. Inside Troy, the city mourned its greatest defender. Not only the warrior who had stood between them and the Greeks, but the man who had carried their fear, their hope, and their future. From the walls, Priam watched every day as the body of his son was dragged through the dust below, unable to mourn him, unable to bury him, unable to bring him home. On the 12th night, Priam made a decision that everyone around him called madness. He would go to Achilles himself, alone and unprotected. He would ask for the body of his son. The gods helped him cross, unseen. Hermes guided him through the darkness, past the Greek lines and into the enemy camp, until Priam reached the tent where Achilles sat alone with his grief, his victory, and the emptiness between them. Then Priam walked in and knelt at the feet of Achilles. At first, Achilles did not understand who this old man was. Then Priam said it himself.
I am Priam, father of Hector, king of Troy.
And for a moment even Achilles went still. He had not come as a king. He had come as a father. Then he did something Achilles had not expected. He took Achilles' hands and kissed them. And in that single act, Priam carried a pain no father should ever have to endure, kissing the hands of the man who had killed his son. Then he asked Achilles to remember his own father. Peleus, old and waiting far away in Greece, had sent his son to war knowing he might never come back. Achilles looked at the old man kneeling before him and felt something inside him break open. For the first time since Hector fell, his rage loosened its grip, and Achilles wept. He wept for his father, who would never see him return. He wept for Patroclus, the friend he could not bring back. And he wept for the old king kneeling before him, asking for the one thing every father should be allowed to give his son: a farewell. Two enemies sat together in the dark, held by the same grief. Then Achilles raised Priam from the ground and gave him his son back. And before Priam left, Achilles gave him something more: time. Enough for Hector to receive the honors he deserved, and for Troy to say goodbye to its hero before the war began again. Andromache stood before the funeral pyre, saying goodbye to the man who had been everything to her. And to the father, their son would now know only through stories. Troy buried its hero. And when the 11 days Achilles had promised were over, the war resumed. Troy still stood, and it had lost its greatest defender. Agamemnon understood the moment. The Greeks had Achilles back, and for the first time in years, the city looked vulnerable. So Agamemnon pushed. The Greeks pressed harder toward the walls, and Achilles went with them. Even after Hector's death, his pain had not faded. If anything, it drove him deeper into the war. as if more killing could give him what revenge had not. Then, outside the walls of Troy, it happened. Paris saw his chance to avenge his brother from a distance. So he took aim and shot at Achilles. The arrow flew. Guided by the god who had watched this war from the beginning, it struck the one place Achilles could not survive: his heel. The greatest warrior who ever lived fell outside the walls of the city he had given everything to destroy. For a moment, the battlefield went still, as if even the war needed time to understand that Achilles was dead. And there, in the dust of Troy, the prophecy was finally fulfilled. Achilles, the greatest warrior Greece had ever seen, had won the eternal glory he had traded his life for, leaving behind a name that would never be forgotten, and a war that no longer knew how to continue without him. After 10 years, the war had reached a deadlock. The greatest warriors on both sides were gone. Achilles, Hector, both dead. And the war that had consumed 10 years and countless lives had no clear end in sight. Now someone else had to step forward. Not a warrior this time. Not a man who won battles by strength or by glory. A man who won them by thinking. His name was Odysseus. And his story was just beginning. If you want to know what happened next, how Troy finally fell, and what it cost the man who ended the war to find his way home, that story is already waiting for you on our channel. It's called the Odyssey.